Welcome to what we hope to be the first of many Refilwe's roundtables right here, brought to you by CapeTalk. If you've been making your way around Cape Town for the past month, you might have seen my face on a magazine, The Big Issue. The guest editing role that I got the privilege to take part in with The Big Issue allowed me to explore something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. We've been away from our cities now for 2 years exactly, as we sit here in March 2022, held back by lockdown regulations, and are finally making our way right back in to them. The question that I had is, can we awaken the sleeping giant? Cities tend to be the hubs that drive economic growth and certainly idea generation. And I invited a wonderful group of individuals who are committed to exactly this to help us understand and unpack whether or not that actually is possible. Lorenzo Davis is the CEO of the Development Impact Fund and has been on the show many times. And his piece regarding the delayed reset really challenges the notion of returning to the cities and actually being able to awaken a sleeping giant. Jody Allemeier is an urban specialist, and her piece, Show Up Ready or Not, is also a challenge that says, how are we going to get ourselves this moonshot multiplier that is going to take us out of the inertia that I think we often find ourselves in, what we admit to be a dichotomous city. And Rob Kane, CEO of Boxwood Properties, as well as the chair of the CCID, and an illustrious and lengthy career in property development, you're very familiar with the spaces that we have to navigate in awakening the sleeping giant. There are three missing voices today. Ryan McFadden is the CEO, or at least the founder and head strategist at Have You Heard, marketing outfit that focuses its energy on culture and the establishment and the pervasiveness of culture. His piece is mentoring micropreneurs, which I'm keen to hear all of your thoughts on. And our two executive mayors who contributed to this edition, Dr. Paul Paladze, the executive mayor of Johannesburg, who speaks about actually opening up Joburg a little bit more, as well as giving us a view from the top, as he called it. Jordan Hilders, the executive mayor of the city of Cape Town. In this issue, certain words came up quite regularly in all of your pieces, as well as the things that we were concerned about: collective effort, inclusion, and making sure that compassion is something that is brought to the front. And I think that came from all 6 of your pieces. Lorenzo, in the challenge that you give us, when you say the delayed reset, in what ways are those 3 elements missing, or are you starting to see shoots of them?
Yeah, thank you, Refilwe. I think that we are struggling to make sense of this return to normal, or the new normal. I think the conversations about it are far too few for me. I think there's not a robust conversation happening about what reset is all about. I think that those words of inclusivity and compassion and building a new model of what a city should look like, what is the new post-pandemic environment we all live in, I think it's so poorly defined. I think people just want to come back and populate spaces again. And I'm saying, hold on, we have to stand, as I say in the end of my article, stand in the middle of Adderley Street and say, hold on, what should this be? All of us, journalists and media people and academics and street people and everybody. We have so many parking garages all over Cape Town in buildings. They are standing empty. They are at 25, 35%, 45% occupancy with cars. What happens to the additional space? Why are they not converted into small business space or social housing spaces or communal spaces for people to meet and greet, or civic spaces for non-profit entities to use? So can we talk about the redesign as a broad concept, not just sort of this architectural approach to redesign?
This is the perfect day to have this conversation. Yesterday, Boxwood Properties opened 3 of your buildings downtown, the 9 Lower Berg Street, which we know as the Box. For anyone who's watching us today, you'll see the big sign Luno at the top, and that's how you'll identify it. The Felix, as well as 14 on Long. All 3 of these try to bring in all of these considerations, the architecture as well as the movement.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about when you ventured into this project, the 70 million rand investment that you made into the city quite early in the pandemic, taking quite a bit of risk.
As Boxwood Property Fund, and also as the CCID. The board of the CCID just comprises most of the large property owners and quite a diverse range in the city. But everybody there, none of the board earns a cent, and they're all invested in the city. So when we attend board meetings, everybody's pretty committed, and you have a lot of focus from them, because collectively everybody needs that city to be successful. And when COVID hit, it was actually terrifying. As the CID and as Boxwood, it really was. Because we had no visibility. Not even 2 months ahead, or 3 months, or 6 months, or 2 years. And the newspapers were full of, this is the end of the office. We can't go forward. People are going to work from home forever. It was a pretty scary place. We did a huge amount of research. And we went back and researched why do cities exist? And we looked at old cities like London and Paris that had been here for 2,000 years. And our conclusion was that fast Wi-Fi was not going to destroy our cities. It was going to change the way that they work and probably change the amount of time that people spent in offices. But the essence of a city centre is that people want to come together to meet, to do business. Our parking usage and patronage is up 46%. And from a year ago, it's up 76%. So people are coming back. But we sense a huge urgency that we need to get people back quickly, because as South Africans, we're not going to grow our economy and our businesses working from home. And if we're honest about it, the four of us have a lot of privilege. You know, we go home and we have fast Wi-Fi. Most people don't. Lots of people are sharing kitchen tables to try and work. And they have blackouts and things like that. So it's not so easy for a lot of people. So we've been encouraging people back to the office. And one of the things was, when we were out of the hard lockdown, the team of Boxwood, we were in and out of about 25 buildings. And I'm telling you, by about the 15th, they all looked the same. They're just really boring. And what we thought was that when people come back to the office, they're not going to be happy coming into a really boring environment. So we thought we have to make the environment softer and more tactile and more interesting. And that's the 3 redevelopments that we've done. And there's vibrant colors, they're quite quirky, there's all sorts of nuances in there, and it's softer. The salt market that you were talking about in the Lino building, we got 9 and soon 11 food retailers. So there's a nice offering of vegetarian, halal, there's a bar there, and it just makes it a really cool space. And if Refilwe, you can go and work in it. There's fast Wi-Fi, everything.
It's very impressive. I saw it yesterday, and it felt like it was elevating the level of the city. But there's a point that you're making about the urgency, and that Lorenzo is making about the 2 ways that we're redeveloping. On the one hand, architecturally, but when you speak of softness, I think you speak to a lot of what Jody's trying to remind us of, is the societal shape, ability of movement in and around the city. And to what extent do you think we're able to get there, ready or not?
How do we come in and change and recover and grow in a way that not only protects what we had before, but starts to break down barriers to inclusion that exist in our economy. And those barriers to inclusion, not only in our economy, but in our democracy and in our society and in all of these things. But I think what Rod's talking about is a very practical one in our economy. And those barriers to inclusion are very systemic and very practical and very structural. And it can be quite overwhelming to think, well, not only do we now have to renew and recover, but we also have to deal with these kind of things that perpetuate exclusion and inequality and
delay.
Yeah. And we've grappled. We've struggled many times to have clear conversations with one another about really what is it that keeps this person out of the economy and accumulates gains in productivity to this person in the economy. But I think what examples like what Rob is doing is very powerful, and it's one of the other articles in there, is identifying mechanisms for new entrepreneurs, for new entrants into the space, and saying, we're going to create a space for you. We're going to create smaller spaces, safer spaces, more fail-ready spaces, more minimal viable product spaces. and that for me is quite powerful and quite exciting.
Given that we have the backlog and the failures of transportation at a cheap level to get us all into the city, is that the only place where we can awaken the sleeping giant, or can we do this better in our communities?
Yeah, so that was, I think, the concept of the moonshot multiplier. Firstly, the moonshot, that it's time to start really dreaming and being ambitious again, and to multiply that wherever we are. And I think, again, as individuals, as active citizens, as businesses, sometimes we might feel the ambitions of the city are so big and so overwhelming. It's for somebody else to do and for somebody else to take care of. But if we think about our own scale and where we live and where we take our children to school or the park where they play, and there is something for us to get involved in and something for us to do. And so the concept behind that was that if every person started in their own area, in their own field of influence, with an ambition, with some moonshot project, the multiplication effect of that would be very powerful. So I think in the article I only talk about 2 scales, which is a neighborhood scale and a metro scale, but you could go much wider than that and say, at an individual scale, the park scale, the neighborhood scale, the district scale, the municipality scale, and inside businesses and outside business, everybody in your field of influence have one real ambition, organize around it, and
The fact is that all 4 of us sitting around the table have a reasonable amount of influence to get our ideas out there, to be heard. The fact is also that in order for those influences to play out, we either have access to capital, you've both got funds, or at the least being able to influence those who do. And so if you think about the individual sort of approach that you're talking about, Lorenzo, you tried to do this with your road trip stories, which I thought was very inspirational. The first thing is you spoke about the city's ambitions and you went out into the country and asked, what are yours? To individuals. Can you share a little bit of what we might take that into the city that way?
Yeah, I love this concept that we talk about the sleeping giant, and I think it's defining the size of that giant, which is very, very important. When we speak of the sleeping giant in some communities, it's only the city, the CBD.
Yes.
The sleeping giant is in some cases disconnected from the rest of the city, and we got to see the extended city as the sleeping giant. And so how do you harness all of the potential, all of the assets, all of the resources, and say, this is the sleeping giant. So definition of the sleeping giant is very important. The other thing for me that I love in terms of urban design is the notion of streets as community. So I live on Melville Road. I am the custodian of Melville Road. We know that you can talk of Oxford Street or Fifth Avenue or Broadway, all over the world. You can go mention streets and people know what that street is about. In Cape Town, we've sort of diminished that notion. Now, that's not wrong that we've diminished it, but I don't find a replacement. I don't find this identity emerging where people say, we can speak of District 6 and Tennant Avenue and those words, but we've sort of almost killed that notion that the place where we are localized most is the street I live on. And how do I celebrate that? I don't want to go into my home, because then it becomes, again, this fenced off, sort of isolated little group of self-sustaining people who don't live in a particular ecosystem. I want to live on a street where number 12 and number 16 and number 17 and number 18, as we grew up, we are all friends and we celebrate protecting, nurturing, growing that street, the businesses, etc. So coming back to your question, my road trips showed me that people want to have those conversations. They want to talk about an inclusivity, which is not, I'm invited to an event.
Yes.
Or I'm asked to speak at a seminar, or I'm presenting as somebody from my community. No, that's not the inclusivity they're talking about. They are in inclusivity for them means the conceptualization of ideas. They're in the room.
Yeah.
When the ideas are conceived, the ideas are not brought to them for comment. It is their ideas that's taken out for comment. And that for me is what I found in my dialogues with people all over the Western Cape.
And how do you put those into play?
The difficulty is that we don't have ready-made mechanisms or even the experience to do that. And I think, Jody, you've done a lot of research in communities. It's not a natural for us. I have a 91-year-old mother. She's a wonderful human being, but she's 91 years old. When people come to my home and she's there, she would say, there's white people coming.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
still her language.
Right.
and she's blind and deaf, and I say to her, somebody's coming from the university or somebody's coming from, business, and then she wants to know, are they white?
Okay.
So it's not a ready-made tool, and you can filter that down all the way through to a 60-year-old and a 40-year-old who have those fears. And so there's so much we have to do to unpack and distribute and redesign, that I think we underestimate, Rob and Jody, the task that's there. I think your initiatives are great, but it's the tasks.
Yeah.
Agreed. Go ahead, Rob.
Okay. Lorenzo, I agree with you, but I think also, frankly, what I find really difficult is, and particularly as the City Improvement District, people often talk to me about stuff. And this is an organization that started 21 years ago, and we now employ 623 people, 300 of whom were formerly homeless. They now have jobs cleaning the streets. But people always talk and they say they should do this, they should do that. I honestly think we have to move away from that narrative, and everybody has different roles and positions in society, but those who have influence should be using it more responsibly.
I would say, how many of those homeless people are we migrating into, becoming office admin assistants, not just street cleaners, into assistants to designers, to bring them in and say, hold on, the 5 of you are you're just going to be in our building, you're going to live here, work here, and you're going to comment on everything you see. You tell us what you think. Just to break down the stereotypes of what work and jobs are like. And so you bring in these other energies which we never knew. Because it's the same thing I suggested to the mayor. I said to them in my article, and I said to him personally, take 10 students, bring them into your office, leave them there for a month. Let them just sit there, give them lots of food, and let them just see what you do. And then midway through you ask them, so what do you think? What did you see that I should be doing differently? Just tell me. And give them a big white piece of paper and let them write down or draw and design. I'm thinking, for me, it's the energy we are not unlocking.
You're in your class, or you're in your income group, or you're in your race, and you're supposed to kind of mind your business there. So the first thing is for there to be a way that beautiful buildings can come up in Hanover Park, and that beautiful, smart people can walk into the box as well to do their work. Scalability is necessary. I'm happy for those 10 students that go into Jordan's office or any executive mayor's office, but how does this become a pervasive cultural way of life, that I can have a moonshot idea, but I can be audacious about anything that I'm able to put my mind to. So I want to put one question here is, we've been having a debate with the team recently about whether or not informal leads formal cultures, or formal industry leads informal. And I think there was a study that Bruce, one of our producers, was looking at and saying, it seems as though formal leads informal. And I thought, no, I feel as though informal corporatizes what they see working in informal. So what comes naturally gets corporatized quite quickly. I can think about the South African taxi industry. I can think about spaza shops that don't, one could say they're replicating big retail, but it was more just coming out of your home. I've got these things to sell. I can think about black hair salons are very much informal, that gets formalized. And so for each of you, I'd like to know who should be leading the people who corporatize what you see in terms of representing a community in a street, like you say, or should we be looking to the expertise that you all have?
If you look at Boxwood, it is in a sense, most people would see it as a corporate.
Yes.
We're very tight-knit, nimble, entrepreneurial organisation.
Yes.
But what we have done in COVID is, and particularly in that South market that you visited yesterday, there were 9 retailers there, quite a few of whom got driven out of business with COVID.
Right.
And they lost everything. So we thought this through, and typically to open up a restaurant is probably 1 or 2 million. It's really expensive. Tables, chairs, cookers, extractors. So we made it very easy for them. All they need to bring is their pots and pans and food, and they can start making money. We've provided tables, chairs, countertops, fridges,
Cleaning
washing
staff.
up facilities, cleaning staff, extractors, air conditioning, music, TVs. It's all there.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly enabling. So I think corporates can do a lot
Yes.
to do that. we spoke earlier about parking garages. We've started up micro businesses. One guy who used to be a waiter in a restaurant we used to go to, and he said to us, he said, "Rob, don't you have something for me?" And I thought about it for a month or two, and I said, "Well, how do you feel about washing a few cars?" So he said, "Well, okay." He's now supporting himself, and pre-COVID, and he's getting back there about another 3 or 4 families. We set him up, and we have collect rainwater off the roof so he can wash the cars. He's now got a business. We started up a boxing gym that we've kitted out, and boxing trainers are not necessarily the best entrepreneurs, but he's coming along.
Right.
And I think in a few months he'll be on his way. So there is so much that we can do, but we just need to open our eyes to that.
Jody, I'm curious to know your answer to this question, because what Rob is describing is an enabler, an enabling environment that's been provided, and if we're honest, there's a hostility in this city between those who run the red tape and those who need to cross it. And I think you've got a good sense of that.
Yeah, so I think the question is a classic kind of big, small, waterfall, agile, invited table or create your own table kind of conversation, right? And I think it does, the answer that really does depend on what type of change it is that you are trying to create. And there are certain types of change that need to be big and need to be driven by those that have. If you're wanting to build a new wastewater treatment plant, it kind of has to be done by those that have the capital and the mandate and the scale to do that. There are other types of change that can be done by a distributed network of role players, and all that needs to be done to enable them is kind of get out the way with red tape and regulation, send signals that actually we like this, we empower you, we will remove the red tape, we will even celebrate you and cheer you along the way. And I think that's where, celebrating street groups and people taking ownership of their public spaces and things like that is an example of that sort of thing. And then in the middle are these projects where the tension often comes up, where it's unclear, is it big or small, who really should take ownership, and that tends to be where there's a power imbalance or a capital imbalance, and that is, I think, where there's a struggle for, I want to get access to the gains of productivity growth, or I want to get access to the decision making process that I don't have access to, and I think that is where a lot of what Lorenzo talks about is part of our renewal needs to be breaking down some of our previous patterns of who makes decisions, who has capital. And I do think we've seen some disruption in that, and I think we also need to disrupt our mentality of where capital sits and things like that. There is capital sitting in townships, there is development happening in townships, there are new emergent developers, so I think we also have like a binary way of thinking about these problems, and we need to kind of put that aside and actually have new frameworks for thinking about where power sits and where capital sits and where influence sits, and work from that new basis for how we answer these questions.
How do we bridge that or change that thinking to say, as it turns out, there's 60 million consumers and sources of profit right in front of us, and any kind of convergence is most likely going to be something that we can all benefit from mutually.
So there's Rob Kane, property developer. I want to find the other 40 Rob Kanes.
That's it.
I don't want to look at Rob and say, Rob, Boxwood is great and you guys have done marvelous work, and I brought guests to the city a few years ago and they're amazed that Cape Town works as well as it does, from other cities. It's working. It's working in the sense that it's a clean, tidy, functioning space. It's not as we would want it to be yet.
Yes, possibly the only South African metropolis that still allows us to be a part of it on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
And blight hasn't taken it over, right?
Yeah. What I want to do is to say, so who else is there? Because you guys have spent a lot of time and energy, over the years to make this functioning. But I want to find the other 60 people.
But they don't necessarily put it out there. But so many of them are doing really good stuff.
Yeah, and so that's the first part of the process, and then to find out the guys who have the same ideas and the same energies, where are the others with the capital, and to bring capital alongside those visionary leaders, those sort of inspired people, and then to find thirdly the intelligence, because that's the other thing that's there. So sometimes there's the capital, there's the visible leaders, but then there's a group of very smart people who sit there and have written some amazing stuff and have designed some amazing concepts. So it's this unearthing process, this kind of going to dig and mine in our suburbs and in our townships and in our communities for 1 million more, 60 more Rob Kanes, and come and say, guys, here's an ongoing conversation taking place. So it's multiplying the energies that are there.
Yes.
And I find that that's often too sterile in our context. It's so led only by the Rob Kanes of the world.
And the networks that you may have,
Yeah.
or that we may have. Go ahead.
But I think there's a lot more energy. We're feeling a lot more energy. I mean, we're watching traffic volumes increasing, but just amongst business people and also in the city. The mayor has been in place for not too many months, and yet I think it was he that drove the closing or the pedestrianisation of Bree and Long Streets. That's hugely successful.
Yeah.
You know, they don't sound like big things, but if you're a retailer and you can put tables and chairs out onto the street, that'll probably increase your turnover probably 20-30%. That's a really big thing. That's the difference between you going out of business and you losing 10 staff, you're now unemployed, or surviving. So those changes are happening. It's really good to see it.
People drove in to town in the morning and drove out in the evening, or came in on the train. The trains were working. Most of Bree Street didn't exist as restaurants. That whole strip didn't exist as restaurants and things like that. And it was a big drive to say, how do we get an evening culture and a nightlife into town apart from the Long Street strip, which did exist. And there were two things. I think there were probably a lot of other coinciding factors, but there were two things for me that kind of drove that. There was the continued work of the CID to keep town sort of safe and clean and that sort of thing. There was a growth in a residential / temporary residential market. So there was some residential supply, and then also the Airbnb supply. So not permanent residential, but short stay accommodations. There were more people sleeping over in town at night. So there was a market that got introduced to the space. And then there was an offering that got introduced to the space. And it started as temporary offerings. It started through events like First Thursdays. Gareth Pearson deserves an award for what he did for the city. Of that regular, every First Thursday you can come to the city, you can extend the hours by a certain amount of time, and people got used to the idea of, I can be in town and this is what it's going to look like. And I think what's happening now with the Saturday night things is another example of that, of just it's offering that supply side to people of, this is what the market can supply you. Now we have to reintroduce the demand side of the market to town. And so, how do we apply that lesson to other places of the basic urban management has to be in place? What is the market that we can introduce? It's not always going to be residential, sometimes it'll be something else. What is the supply side that you can introduce? It won't always be events and cultural events and dining on the street. Sometimes it'll be something else. But those ingredients always have to be there. And Cape Town is diverse. It's not like other cities that it's just a financial district. I think those places that's just a financial district are in much more trouble than we are. We've actually got huge diversity in terms of what our supply and demand side can be. And we're in quite a lucky position from that perspective. Maybe sometimes we thought that diversity was tricky. But actually, we've got a lot to play with now.
You mentioned Long Street culture. Long Street culture's hurdles were much lower to play in, right? I could be an old store that had been there since the 60s, and the culture of it that everybody was excited to kind of experience, or the mix, was much easier for me to get in. We have had some wonderful advancement, including through keeping the city improvement going up, and therefore it's just much more expensive to get on the bottom rung. Both from wanting to open any kind of retail or kind of business, but also from the perspective of the welcoming nature of the city. So as we've had these improvements and people have profited and done well, I sense, in terms of ownership in particular, a tightening of sort of the controls of who is welcome, right? I say that as an entrepreneur battling with broski relationships that are saying, no, that building's ready, and I'm just fighting in the classifieds. There's again back to the attitude about who's welcome at the table, or back to, I mean, should a Stockfell be coming together to the city and saying we have the capital that meets the level of half a Rob Kane and can also compete, or should we be lowering the hurdle without lowering the quality? Just in terms of being able, I miss the mom and pop, and one of the things that comes with advancement, for example, in New York, is eventually mom and pop gets pushed out, or they're the ones who suffered in the pandemic. And again, unless I have an enabler who's able to say, let's look at your business differently, it ends up with a Chase Manhattan and a CVS on every corner, as opposed to, a bodega. The Long Street thing just harked back to a time when it wasn't just diversity of business, it was diversity of what a business owner is.
Yeah. I just
Can
want to
you
comment
help
on
me
that.
with that?
I want to comment on that because I was in Long Street yesterday and I walked it twice up and down. And that for me is a particular challenge. I'm seeing empty stores now. I'm seeing businesses for sale, and I'm worried about that. And I know that sort of change over from the kind of traditional, localized, 50-year in-residence trader has disappeared, is gone. Now a franchise is moving in, and I go like, that's not exactly the good feel that it gives me. There's no uniqueness anymore. There's no sort of a space you can go to and say, there's a cigar shop, or there's a a guy who fixes shoes but in a particular way, or makes creams or whatever it is in a particular way. That's gone. I see that more and more. And there was just a row of shops standing empty. Now most of them were food places, that couldn't survive without trade. But I am worried that it's going to become Chase Manhattan, CVS, and that's
ATMs and pharmacies always, they can, and we're grateful for the consistent rents, obviously, but it does change the nature of a walk down a street.
If we can replicate that image of both corporatization but also familiar and localized, and make that hybrid work, that's the model that you can then take to a township. You can then take to another community. You can then say, this is how we can redesign it, so that nobody feels I always have to enter at the 12th rung instead of, no, I can come in at the bottom rung. I'm going to get to the 12th, or if I wish to, but if I don't want to, I can stay at the bottom rung. I'll still be competitive. I'll still be making money. And creating that kind of hybrid model for business, for trading, for both supply and demand, is for me where I find there's going to be a new energy that emerges there.
What we're building now is not we're building, but we're finding somebody else to build it, is a decent informal trader shelter. At the moment there are those wireframes and they put black plastic over it, and it doesn't really help their business. We're trying to design one that can be locked up at night and it's secure, and the person can keep all the goods that they're selling in there. So those are sort of pilots that are going on. And then also the community-orientated stuff that you're talking about. What we have found is that because the city centre is working, it's a good place to try things out. And you'll remember Open Streets.
Yes.
Where did Open Streets start? It started in the city on Bree Street. And they worked out that formula, and I think they were extremely good at it. And then they moved it to Lange and Athlone.
Is there room for me to live above the place where my shop front is anymore? Is there any space for the average person to afford to live in the city? Because for as long as transport remains a problem, and it will, I think our mayor is focused on it, I think many stakeholders are, but it will take a while. So can I ever imagine living above my shop in the city ever again? Honestly, I mean, because you obviously understand property very well, you work in it. Is that even something that players desire? Like we've cleaned it, we've shimmied it up now, no more.
To that extent, the city is almost a victim of its own success. Because if you would have bought a building 20 years ago, 21 years ago when this had started, honestly the sellers were actually pretty much giving you the building.
Yeah.
So over time, the value of those buildings has increased, which has been fantastic for the city. Because I think about 17 years ago, the rate space in the city was 6 billion. The rate space is now 44 billion.
Okay.
So an awful lot of that money that the city collects, it can then deploy into more impoverished areas.
Right.
So overall, it's been a very, very successful model. But the downside of that is your property's now quite expensive. So if you convert that office space into an apartment, and there's a lot of them going on at the moment, and I think it's very successfully done, and I think it's good for the city. The rental that you need to achieve for that apartment is quite high, based on the cost of refurbishing it and the original cost of the building. So it does make very affordable housing in the city centre difficult.
But not impossible.
It's a real challenge, not impossible.
And I'm definitely an advocate for affordable housing, and I think the best way to do it is through state subsidized housing. That's through social housing. That's kind of the only guaranteed way to do it. And then there's other mechanisms to have relatively affordable housing through regulatory mechanisms and upzoning and things like that. But I do think that there is a limit to you as a hypothetical shop owner, your ability to own an apartment near or upstairs from your shop that is directly linked to your earning ability. And the average income in Cape Town, average household income in Cape Town is around 10,000 Rand a month. And until we address that problem, there is a cap on what a developer can do. A developer can only build a unit of so many square meters that a person or a household of 10,000 Rand a month can afford to buy or rent. And so we have to look at both sides of the equation. And I think looking at what's happening on the ground floor, what your shop can be rented to you for. So actually looking at the size of shops and having incubator models that progress your shop through different sizes, from a smaller size to a bigger size to a bigger size, having incentives for landlords and for businesses to stay mom and pop or to stay a certain size, and there's models from Seattle and other places where they encourage local ownership to reduce leakage from the economy and things like that through design guidelines and zoning guidelines and things like that. It can be done, but having these sorts of progression models so that eventually your household income increases from 10,000 Rand a month to 25,000 Rand a month to 30,000 Rand a month.
For sure.
Then both sides of the equation start to shift, and we're not only looking at just one side of the equation. We do need to look at just the affordability side for the group that will never progress, but we have to have that progression discussion as much.
Again, the social mobility. I mean, so please don't get me wrong. I wasn't putting this on the developers to get done.
No, I'm very happy.
I am very much involved. I am very much interested in seeing what state or city intervention can happen, because I think it's the only way to not have to take that 44 billion and send it out somewhere else if we're all sharing in it in the same place. And there are ways that one can position a portfolio of property as the city to say that I'm okay to take the hit on this 20% corner here for people to not have to lose all that money on transportation on a daily basis coming to work, which by the way may well be servicing people in Boxwood properties, right? As you mentioned, the Boxwood sort of developments are not just about the CEOs, it's about everybody who works in the building. And so so I'd be curious to see more. I will hear more about those kinds of intervention. I'm looking for the moonshot, right? And even the cities, when I've spoken to you all about if we could be a 24-hour city and get more economic activity going, I'm often told by station managers, like, it was not in this lifetime, but it's nice for you to talk about it. But I sometimes think we could. Not to say that they're the be-all and the panacea, because 24-hour cities like New York have got people in rent-controlled apartments being moved out as well.
The issue is we have a plan on the table that says for the first 10 years we're going to take a hit here. But what we are growing is the mass. We're bringing people into the space. So we're going to take the hit, but every other business is going to grow because of the demand side is coming in. We're bringing people into this space. Right now, people don't come here because they think, I can't afford a burger at, restaurant X.
Yes.
I'm not going to go to, buy a ice cream in Sea Point because I can't afford the thing.
Yes.
I can get it in Athlone or in Umfuleni for,
Yes.
a quarter of the price. So one of the wisdoms, I think, of creating this mass of people that you see across the world in urban spaces is to open up zones in the city where their demand can be accommodated. And we don't have that. No matter where you go in the city, it's a pretty expensive place. And I want to see us bringing people in with business saying, or the city saying rather, we'll take a hit, business will help you, we'll take the hit, but getting people in here to love the space and trade in the space or shop in the space and spend in the space, that's a big deal. Is that possible as an alternative economy?
I think when you say we should do that, I think it's really important to unpack who we is.
Okay.
And I think that's really valuable because there are pockets of land around the city, District 6 being one.
It came to mind.
District 6 started because it was walkable distance into town, walkable distance to the textile factories in Woodstock.
Yeah.
That area hasn't been developed. And to be honest, it hasn't been, people like me don't want to go there because I think there's bad karma there.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry, but I do not want to develop in an area where I'm going to have somebody walk up to me and say, Rob, I used to live there, now you've built a fancy apartment or something. So, but there is that opportunity, but they are complicated because the communities are still quite active there. So it's very difficult if you're saying to a developer, you must give up the value of your building for 10 years. Because most of us buy a building and we go across to the bank, we borrow, frankly, far too much money. And then you need to service that mortgage. The banks generally are not very sympathetic when you say, well, I've decided to do something that will not earn as much money, because they still want their premiums paid.
Fair.
So it's quite nuanced like that, and I think it's a really valuable debate that we need to have. The sooner we're honest about that, the better, and we will then maybe be realistic in terms of what's achievable, and we can go forward.
Development finance institutions, for me, are a big part of the who we is. So at whatever level, if I'm talking to a government, if I'm talking to a small business owner, the, again, red tape of the development finance institution approval process is heavy. It's complex. If I wanted to sell chicken feet at the taxi rank, I'm not the same person who's going to have my NAV done by my tax person, and I'm not going to have a 70-page business plan necessarily, for example, if I go to the small development fund. Risk is not taken because the person who's doing the decision making doesn't actually know how to understand the product, right? Yeah. So I am an official from a political perspective who's been given a checklist, and this person's not filling the checklist with the forms. Whereas entrepreneurs might get a 3-page story with a sense of location, and who have been active in entrepreneurship, who can say, absolutely, this is most likely going to do very well. And these are loans, I'm talking about, say, 20,000 Rand grant, 500,000 Rand grant, as opposed to, say, an NEF whose dominance in the portfolio is 50 million Rand loans to another mine. I think that the burden upon the state has not been emphasized enough in terms of what it should be doing. And maybe it's not about more money, but it's a different level of expertise. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's we always get shy when we start to talk about the finance institutions and the banks and that. And I mean, we've had so many dialogues where developers happily come, and sometimes they get, we have heated debates and things like that, and there's activists in the city and developers, and there's debates, and the noticeable table that's empty is the banks and the financiers. They're happy to not be a part of the discussion, and maybe that's something we really need to work on. The one thing that's sort of sitting at the back of my mind is the question of scale, and the groups that have managed to do the types of interventions that Lorenzo is talking about, the waterfront comes to mind. You can go to the waterfront and buy a very affordable ice cream next to the skate park and spend the day playing basketball and have your kids skateboarding, and literally downstairs underneath that buy a very cheap ice cream and hamburger and whatever. And they've done that very deliberately as part of their strategy for the precinct, but they can do that because they have the precinct to make money on one and balances it off to have all of those feet. Now, not every developer has that, but are there finances that are active in a whole precinct that you could say actually across your precinct, you actually are one step removed from the developer, but you actually technically have a balance sheet that looks like a precinct, and that would start to be quite an interesting conversation to have.
Because South African DFIs, their raison d'être is not supposed to be pure profit. Right, the ones that are the state-owned ones. It's supposed to be the development of industry. So that I'm never one to take profit away from a person who's there for a profit motivation. I'm saying there is a part of our country that has large pockets of money, and that maybe because we leave it to say, well, the politicians are there, as opposed to saying, actually, I'm pretty good at checking out a balance sheet and deciding whether or not a business does well, and I'd love to put myself up to sit on a board. I don't know. I mean, those 10 kids that sit in the mayor's office, and learn something. Is there a way that we can bring the expertise, if not the finance, to quicken decision cycles and make it easier to spot wonderful opportunities, even if they're quite small?
Your point is a good one. We shouldn't be looking to the large corporates or institutions for them to do anything. The future of this country is in small organizations. Anglo-Americans are a fraction size of what they were 20, 30 years ago. It's the smaller businesses that are going to drive this economy.
How do we make sure that it's not just the restaurants that are very kind of consumer driven, but other forms of industry and business and space and things like that are actually sort of ready to welcome this new energy, and that it reaches a wider group of people, that younger people and things like that actually can come into contact.
At the moment, the city only offers you corporate or container. There isn't this kind of hybrid sort of mix of space that just people can go to and say, I can trade here, I can trade there. This is mid-level, that's mini-level, this is a little bit more upmarket, this is just below upmarket. I have a choice. It meets the kind of business demand that I have. And that's what I want to see emerge out of our dialogues. Now, yes, there are empty stalls now, empty, on the parade and in Long Street, empty spaces. But they're still charging corporate rents. They're still charging rentals that most people can't afford. So creating a city that invites the inflow of capital, as well as cater for the sort of mixture, the hybrid of economic opportunities that's there. That's the one thing that I think is very important. The other part that I think we must begin to look at are these multiple conversations that we must have. I mean, this is a great conversation. I just think, it's Jody, it's Lorenzo, it's Rob, it's Refilwe, and I really want to encourage, again, I'm talking to the CID about this, so I'm giving you guys sort of, part of what I see as a CID should do, are these multiple conversations. We don't have it enough happening within the sort of urban space. It's either, there's a seminar on finance at ENY, or the budget is discussed at, Sanlam, and you can go to Old Mutual and they'll present the latest, projections. And I go like, okay, but that's not the conversations I want to sit in. It's Woodstock Main Road, I can go sit there somewhere in a coffee shop and there's some, techie sitting, or some design guys or artists sitting and they're talking about it. But it's got to be a more profound part of our existence.
I suppose in the CapeTalk sort of lane of things, we can city faves our way to death every Friday and try to put a spotlight on new businesses. But the first thing I want to thank you for is bringing the conversation to a broader audience through your articles on the big issue. Again, 25 Rand, it's not a big deal. So I'm hoping this is just the beginning of many roundtables, and that we can we can amplify. I think that's the job of CapeTalk, is just to amplify where those voices happen to be. And we try very hard not to stay, as much as we love the CID, just in the city centre. I, for example, am dying to understand, as a person who loves using the Sea Point pools, why that entire space underneath it has not been sort of turned into retail, mom and pop ice cream sales. You've got this captive audience that would love a different locker that maybe I pay R1 to use and it's safe and can sort of become a parking space. So I have no fear whatsoever that capital will follow brilliant ideas. And I'll endeavour and hope that I can continue to invite you all to help us amplify the well thought through ideas that I'm sure are amongst many who haven't necessarily been heard, because that's what we all have on our side, I think.
Yeah.
With that, thank you very much to all three of you for joining the conversation. Let's hope this is the beginning of many more. And please share your comments below and let us know what we could be doing better or where we're absolutely wrong. This is Refilwe's Roundtable from CapeTalk.